Forget marble statues. The ancient world was a grim spectacle, run by divine hunters who demanded human sacrifice and destroyed lives on a whim. We're peeling back the layers of their madness. This is Shroud of Lore.
While glory-hungry heroes marched toward Troy, Achilles hid shamefully in women's garments, and Odysseus drove a heavy plow toward his own infant son, each desperate to escape the bloody harvest at any cost. But those desperate measures had not yet been taken. First came the messengers. Odysseus stood on the cliffs of Ithaca, watching the ship approach from the east. He knew what it carried before it reached the harbor, knew it the way a man knows the smell of his own death. The black sail. The bronze-armored men on deck. The terrible purpose that radiated from every line of the vessel. The oath had come due. He had been young when he swore it. Young and clever, too clever for his own good. He had devised the very oath that now bound him, the promise that every suitor of Helen would defend her marriage against any who threatened it. At the time, it had seemed like elegant solution to an impossible problem. He had even extracted a reward for his cunning, help winning the hand of Penelope, his beloved wife. Now Penelope stood beside him on the cliff, their infant son Telemachus in her arms, and Odysseus understood the true cost of his cleverness. "You do not have to go," Penelope said quietly. "There must be some way." "There is no way." Odysseus' voice was hollow. "I wrote the oath myself. I know exactly how binding it is. Every king who stood in that courtyard swore to defend Menelaus. If I refuse, the gods themselves will punish my cowardice. My name will be cursed. Ithaca will be destroyed. And if you go?" The question hung in the salt air. Odysseus did not answer, because they both knew what the seers had prophesied. If he sailed to Troy, he would not return for 20 years. 20 years of war and wandering, while his son grew up without a father and his wife grew old waiting for a husband who might never come home. If he came home at all. The ship reached the harbor. Odysseus watched Agamemnon's men disembark, watched them march up the winding path toward his palace with the inevitable patience of fate itself. He had perhaps an hour before they arrived. An hour to find some escape from a trap he had built with his own hands. "There might be one way," he said slowly. "The oath binds warriors. Men of sound mind and able body. But it cannot bind a madman." Penelope stared at him. "You would feign insanity?" "I would do anything to stay with you and our son." He turned to face her, gripping her shoulders with desperate intensity. "Listen to me, Penelope. When the messengers arrive, you must act as though you've been living with my madness for months. Weep. Beg them to leave your poor broken husband in peace. Can you do this?" "I can do anything for you," she whispered. "But Odysseus, if they see through the deception, they will not. I am the cleverest man in Greece, remember? They expect tricks from me. This time, I'll give them a trick so convincing that even the gods will believe it." He kissed her forehead, then his son's. The baby gurgled, reaching for his father's beard with tiny fingers. Odysseus felt his heart crack along fault lines he had not known existed. Then he walked to the stables, yoked an ox and a donkey to his plow, and began the performance that would either save his family or damn his soul. Far to the south, on the island of Scyros, another mother clutched another son with the same desperate love. Thetis was not mortal, but she understood mortality better than any goddess on Olympus. She had seen the fates weave her son's destiny the moment he was born, a short life blazing with glory, or a long life lost in obscurity. She had tried everything to change it. She had dipped him in the river Styx, held him by the heel as immortal waters washed over his skin, hoping to make him invulnerable. It had not been enough. Nothing was ever enough. "You cannot go to Troy," she told Achilles now, her divine form flickering with agitation. "The prophecy is clear. If you sail with the Greeks, you will win eternal fame, and die young, far from home, never knowing your own children." Achilles was 17, already the greatest warrior Greece had ever produced. His body was a weapon forged by gods and trained by centaurs. His speed, his strength, his skill with spear and sword, all of it marked him for the destiny his mother feared. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "You will live. Grow old. Father sons who will remember you as a kind man rather than a legend." Thetis' voice broke. "Please, my son. I am asking you to choose life over glory. Is that so terrible?" Achilles looked at his hands that had never known defeat, that itched for the weight of a sword the way other men's hands itched for gold. He thought of the stories he had grown up hearing: Heracles, Perseus, Theseus. Heroes who had blazed across the world and earned immortal names. Then he thought of his father Peleus, aging alone in his palace, waiting for a son who would never return. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Thetis smiled, and there was something terrible in that smile, the desperation of a mother who would sacrifice anything, even her son's honor, to keep him alive. "King Lycomedes of Scyros has daughters," she said. "Beautiful daughters, kept safe in the women's quarters of his palace. No one would think to look for the greatest warrior in Greece among giggling maidens. You want me to dress as a woman? I want you to live." Thetis reached for his hand. "Please, Achilles. Put aside your pride. Hide your strength. Let the war happen without you, and when it's over, when the other fools have spent their lives on Trojan sand, you can emerge and live the quiet life you deserve." Achilles closed his eyes. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea. He was meant for battle, for glory, for the immortal fame that only came from proving yourself against impossible odds. Hiding in women's clothes was the antithesis of everything he had been trained to be. But his mother was weeping. His mother, a goddess, was weeping for him. "Very well," he said. "I will hide. But know this, mother, if they find me, if anyone discovers the truth, I will not run again. I will face whatever fate the gods have written, and I will make them remember my name." The salt burned Odysseus' eyes as he scattered another handful across the furrow. He had been plowing since dawn, driving his mismatched team across the rocky fields of Ithaca while the Greek delegation watched from the hillside. 3 days now. 3 days of pretending to be mad, of muttering nonsense to himself, of sowing salt instead of seed in soil that would grow nothing for a generation. The act was working. He could see it in the faces of the messengers, the confusion, the pity, the growing conviction that the great Odysseus had finally broken under some invisible strain. Agamemnon's representative, a sharp-eyed man named Palamedes, had questioned the servants and examined the evidence. Everything pointed to genuine madness. But Palamedes had not left. That worried Odysseus more than he wanted to admit. The man was clever, perhaps the only man in Greece whose mind could match Odysseus' own. He had been watching the performance with an expression that never quite reached belief, asking questions that seemed innocent but probed at the edges of the deception. "Your husband speaks of his ships," Palamedes had said to Penelope. "He rambles about trade routes and navigation. Strange subjects for a madman." "He was a sailor before his mind broke," Penelope had replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "The sea is all he remembers." Now, on the third day, Palamedes approached the field alone. Odysseus kept plowing, kept muttering, kept his eyes unfocused and his movements erratic. The plow blade bit into the earth, turning up rocks and roots along with the salt-poisoned soil. He could feel Palamedes' gaze on him like a physical weight. "King Odysseus," Palamedes called out. "I bring news that might penetrate even your madness. Your wife is in danger." Odysseus did not react. He kept walking, kept plowing, kept scattering salt from the pouch at his hip. "Interesting," Palamedes murmured. "A truly mad man would have responded to that. Let us try something else." He turned and walked back toward the palace. Odysseus allowed himself a moment of relief. The test had been passed. Soon the delegation would leave, would report that the king of Ithaca was beyond help, and Palamedes returned carrying something in his arms. Something small. Something that gurgled and reached toward the sky with tiny fingers. Telemachus. I wonder, Palamedes said conversationally, walking toward the furrow, what a madman would do if his only son were placed in the path of his plow. He set the baby on the ground directly ahead of Odysseus. The infant sat in the dirt, looking around with curious eyes, utterly unaware of the iron blade approaching. Odysseus' hands tightened on the plow handles. The ox and donkey kept walking, kept pulling, kept dragging the blade closer to his son. 10 feet. 5 feet. 3. He could let it happen. A true madman would not recognize the danger. A true madman would plow right over his own child without hesitation. If he stopped, if he showed any sign of rational thought, the deception would be exposed and, Telemachus laughed. A bright, innocent sound that cut through all of Odysseus' calculations like a sword through silk. He wrenched the plow aside. The blade missed the baby by inches, carving a new furrow in the salt white earth. Odysseus dropped to his knees, scooping his son into his arms, pressing the small warm body against his chest while his heart hammered and his carefully constructed fiction collapsed around him. There he is, Palamedes said softly. The cleverest man in Greece. The one who wrote the oath that now binds us all. He crouched beside Odysseus, his voice gentle but implacable. You cannot escape this, king of Ithaca. None of us can. Helen is stolen, the oath is invoked, and every man who stood in that courtyard must answer the call. Even you. Odysseus looked up at him, and for the first time in 3 days, his eyes were clear. I know, he said. I have always known. I just hoped. We all hoped. Palamedes stood. The ships gather at Aulis. Agamemnon expects you within the month. Bring your warriors, bring your ships, bring that famous cunning mind of yours. Troy will need breaking, and there is no one better suited to break it. He walked away, leaving Odysseus kneeling in the salted field, clutching his son, understanding at last that the trap he had built so many years ago had finally closed around him. On Scyros, Achilles was discovering his own limits. The women's quarters were stifling. The clothes were ridiculous, layers of fine cloth that tangled around his legs and made movement impossible. The other girls giggled at his awkwardness, thinking him merely shy, never suspecting that beneath the perfumed veils lurked a warrior who could kill every guard in the palace before they drew their swords. 3 months. 3 months of hiding, of playing the part of a timid maiden, of suppressing every instinct that made him who he was. His muscles ached from disuse. His mind screamed for the clarity of combat. Every morning he woke reaching for a spear that was not there. But his mother visited often, and each time she reminded him of the stakes. Glory or life? Fame or family? The choice had been made, and he had to live with it. Then Odysseus came to Scyros. The king of Ithaca had been forced to join the Greek cause, but his cunning had not diminished. If he had to go to war, he would make sure the greatest warrior in Greece went with him. He arrived at Lycomedes' palace bearing gifts, jewelry and fine fabrics for the princesses, he claimed. But hidden among the treasures was something else entirely. Achilles was with the other maidens when the gifts were presented. He watched the real princesses exclaim over the jewelry, the perfumes, the bolts of silk. He kept his head down, his hands folded demurely in his lap, every inch the shy young woman he pretended to be. Then his eyes fell on the sword. It lay half hidden beneath a pile of fabric, a beautiful weapon, its blade gleaming even in the dim light of the women's quarters. Achilles' breath caught. His fingers twitched. 3 months of suppression crumbled in an instant as his warrior's soul recognized the one thing it had been starving for. He did not even realize he had moved until the sword was in his hand. At that same moment, Odysseus' men raised a battle cry outside the window. The clash of bronze, the shouts of warriors, the sounds of a raid, an attack, danger. Achilles reacted on pure instinct. He tore off his veil, raised the sword, and spun toward the door in a combat stance that no maiden could ever have learned. The room fell silent. Odysseus stepped through the doorway, a thin smile on his weathered face. "There you are," he said. "I thought you might be hiding among these lovely flowers. Tell me, son of Peleus, was 3 months in a dress worth avoiding your fate?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Achilles stood in the center of the room, sword raised, every line of his body radiating lethal readiness. Around him, the princesses of Scyros had pressed themselves against the walls, their faces pale with shock and dawning recognition. The greatest warrior in Greece, hidden among them for 3 months, now revealed by a simple trick of trumpets and steel. "There was no raid," Achilles said slowly. "No attack. Just a test." Odysseus spread his hands. "And you passed beautifully." A true maiden would have screamed and fled. Only Achilles, son of Thetis, would grab a sword at the first sound of battle. The sword trembled in Achilles' grip. He could still fight. He could cut his way out of this palace, steal a ship, flee to some distant land where no one knew his name. The goddess his mother could hide him again, find some deeper disguise, some more remote refuge. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew they were empty. Odysseus had found him once. Others would find him again. There was no escaping the war that called to him, the destiny that had been woven into his blood before he was born. "My mother will never forgive this," Achilles said. "Your mother wants you to live. I understand that. But there are worse things than dying, son of Peleus." Odysseus stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I had a choice too, you know. I could have plowed my son into the earth and maintained my deception. I would have kept my life, but lost everything that made it worth living. And you think glory is worth dying for? I think some things are worse than death. Dishonor. Cowardice. Living a long life knowing you betrayed everything you were meant to be." Odysseus met his eyes. "You are not made for women's quarters, Achilles. You were made for immortal fame. The question is whether you claim it, or hide from it until it withers into nothing." Achilles lowered the sword. The anger drained from his body, replaced by something colder, the resignation of a man who sees his fate approaching and chooses to meet it standing. "The prophecy says I will die at Troy. The prophecy says you will win eternal glory and die young. That's not quite the same thing." Odysseus smiled grimly. "Besides, prophecies are tricky. I've learned that the hard way. They tell you what will happen, not how or why. Perhaps you die in the first battle. Perhaps you die in the last hour of the war, having achieved everything you ever dreamed. The gods do not share those details." From the doorway, a new voice spoke. "He's right, you know." Both men turned. One of the princesses had stepped forward, a young woman Achilles had known as Deidamia. But she was not looking at him with fear or shock. She was looking at him with something like resignation, and beneath her gown, the unmistakable swell of pregnancy. "Deidamia," Achilles whispered. "Did you think I did not know?" She laughed softly. "From the first night you arrived, I knew you were no maiden. Women recognize the difference, even when men cannot." She touched her belly. "I carry your child, Achilles. A son, the midwives believe. He will be born after you sail for Troy." The world tilted beneath Achilles' feet. A son. He had a son, or would have, in a few months' time. A child who would grow up never knowing his father, just as the prophecy warned. A child who would hear stories of Achilles the great warrior, Achilles the immortal hero, and never feel his father's arms around him. "I did not know," he managed. "I did not want you to know. I thought," Deidamia's voice caught. "I thought if you stayed hidden, if you never sailed for Troy, perhaps you could be here when he's born. Perhaps you could watch him grow. But now. She looked at Odysseus with something like hatred. Now you have no choice. He never had a choice, Odysseus said quietly. None of us do. That's what fate means. Achilles stood frozen between his past and his future, the woman who carried his child, the war that would claim his life, the destiny that had been hunting him since birth. He thought of his mother's tears, of the long empty years she would spend mourning a son who chose glory over life. He thought of the child who would bear his name and his blood, growing up in the shadow of a legend. And he thought of the alternative, hiding forever, running forever, growing old in some distant land while his name faded into nothing and his son learned to be ashamed of a father who chose cowardice over honor. The sword was still in his hand. It felt like an extension of his soul. What is his name? He asked Deidamia. The name you will give my son. Neoptolemus, she whispered. It means, new warrior. Achilles closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the last traces of the frightened boy and woman's clothes had burned away. What remained was something harder, something brighter, a hero accepting the weight of his own legend. Tell him, he said, that his father chose to be remembered. Tell him that some flames burn so bright they cannot last, but their light reaches across centuries. He turned to Odysseus. I will sail with you. But know this, King of Ithaca, if I die at Troy, it will be on my terms. I will not fall to some nameless spear in some forgotten skirmish. If the fates want my life, they will pay dearly for it. I would expect nothing less, Odysseus said. Come. The ships wait at Aulis. The greatest war the world has ever known is about to begin, and it cannot start without us. The harbor at Aulis was a forest of masts. 1,000 ships crowded the bay, their bronze rams gleaming in the morning sun. Odysseus stood at the prow of his vessel, watching the greatest army ever assembled prepare for war. Beside him, Achilles was a statue of bronze and gold, no trace left of the boy who had hidden in women's quarters. What stood here was a weapon forged for one purpose, aimed at a city that did not yet know its doom. Do you regret it? Odysseus asked. The hiding, or the being found? Achilles was silent for a long moment. I regret the time I wasted. 3 months pretending to be something I was not. He turned, and his eyes held a strange, fierce peace. But you freed me from a slower death, the death of living as a shadow of myself. Odysseus nodded. When Polymedes placed my son before my plow, I understood something I had been avoiding for years. We cannot outrun who we are. The fates wove our threads before we were born. All our cunning and hiding are just delays. The pattern remains. The wind shifted. Across the harbor, horns began to sound, the signal to raise anchors, to unfurl sails. The deck moved beneath their feet as crews scrambled to their positions. We are a pitiful pair, Achilles said with a hard laugh. The cleverest man in Greece and the greatest warrior, both reduced to desperate charades. You plowing salt. Me hiding among giggling maidens. He shook his head. The poets will not include those chapters. No. They will sing of glory and courage. They will make us into legends who never doubted, never feared. Odysseus watched the fleet begin to move. Perhaps that is right. Perhaps the running is not the story that matters. What story matters? What we do after we stop running. The choices we make when there are no more escapes. The 1,000 ships surged forward, oars cutting the water in perfect rhythm, prows turning toward the rising sun. On shore, women wept and children waved and old men remembered their own wars. Odysseus did not look back at Ithaca. Achilles raised his spear to the sky, a salute to the gods, a challenge to the enemies waiting across the sea. His voice rang out across the water, let them remember this day. We came not because we were brave, but because we learned that cowardice is its own kind of death. The fleet drove east. 1,000 ships carrying heroes who had tried to escape their fates and failed. And in the salt-stained fields of Ithaca, Where nothing would grow for years, the furrows remained, proof of how far a father would go to save his son, and how little it mattered in the end.